My father introduced me as the bartender to his millionaire friends at my sister's wedding, while they unknowingly toasted with my $12 million tequila company. "This is Julian," Dad said, with that familiar tone of disappointment gesturing toward me like I was something embarrassing he had to explain. He's just the bartender tonight, still trying to figure out his life at 32. His golf buddies laughed. Actually laughed. Like my existence was some kind of joke they were all in on. One of them patted Dad's shoulder sympathetically and said, "Well, at least Tessa turned out successful. For 15 years, I'd been the family failure, the dropout, the one who wasted his business degree on childish dreams instead of getting a real corporate job like my golden child sister. Every family gathering was the same script. Tessa's legal career got center stage, while my entrepreneurship got dismissed as playing with hobbies. Dad loved telling people how I'd never amounted to anything, and how he'd given up hope that I'd ever make him proud. He'd actually said those exact words to my face last Christmas. "I've given up hope you'll ever make me proud." But what made tonight absolutely perfect was that every single guest was raising glasses filled with Kaix Blanco, my premium tequila that Forbes had just featured as one of America's fastest-growing spirits companies. What my father didn't know was that everyone was drinking my company's tequila. This wasn't some new family dynamic. This was 32 years of systematic scapegoating that had started the day I told my father I wanted to build something instead of working for someone else. When I graduated from business school, Robert had my entire life mapped out. Goldman Sachs internship, then a fast track to management consulting, maybe investment banking after a few years. Real careers, he called them. Corporate hierarchies, where success was measured by title progression and salary benchmarks. That was his world, and he expected it to be mine too. But I had different plans. I wanted to create something from scratch, build a business that was mine. When I told him I was starting a spirits company instead of taking the Goldman offer, you would have thought I'd announced I was becoming a street performer. "Julian," he said, shaking his head, with that disappointed expression I'd learned to recognize so well. "You're wasting your potential. Anyone can start a business. Real success happens in established companies with proven systems." From that moment on, every conversation became a reminder of my poor life choices. When my startup struggled in the early years, Dad took it as personal vindication. When I had to bartend to pay bills while building the company, he'd introduce me at family events as the bartender, with obvious embarrassment. Dad called my business degree wasted potential when I chose entrepreneurship over corporate. Meanwhile, my sister Tessa could do no wrong. She followed Dad's blueprint perfectly. Law school, corporate firm, steady promotions. She was everything he'd wanted in a child: predictable, prestigious, profitable, in the traditional sense. When Tessa needed startup capital for her law practice, Dad cut her a check for $50,000 without blinking. Investing in proven success, he called it. When she wanted to buy her condo, he co-signed the loan and helped with the down payment. This wedding alone cost more than I'd made in my first 3 years of business combined. Every family gathering was the same performance. Tessa's latest promotion, her biggest case, victories her partnership track. All while I stood in the corner being treated like the cautionary tale about following your dreams. Tessa's corporate job got family investment, while my startup got silence. But here's what none of them knew. While they were celebrating Tessa's predictable path to middle-class success, I'd built something extraordinary. Kaix Spirits had grown from my bartending-funded startup into a company valued at $12 million. Forbes had featured us in their 30 under 30 list just 2 months ago. We were distributing in 47 states and had 3 major retail partnerships locked in for next year. But Robert had no idea his disappointment son had built a multi-million-dollar empire. When Tessa's wedding invitation arrived 3 months ago, I stared at the elegant cardstock for a long time before deciding whether to RSVP. The embossed lettering, the formal wording, the whole expensive affair screamed Robert's influence and money. Another opportunity for him to showcase his successful daughter, while I played the role of family disappointment. Part of me wanted to skip it entirely. Save myself the humiliation of being introduced as the bartender to another room full of corporate executives and lawyers. Save myself from watching Dad beam with pride over Tessa's achievements, while treating my presence like something he had to apologize for. But something about this wedding felt different. Maybe it was the timing. Forbes had just published their feature on Kaix spirits 2 months earlier, calling us one of America's fastest-growing premium spirits companies. Our Q3 numbers were absolutely crushing expectations. We'd just secured distribution in 47 states, and industry analysts were predicting even bigger growth for next year. Or maybe it was just that I was tired of hiding my success from the family that had written me off years ago. I'd built something undeniable, something even Robert's corporate bias couldn't dismiss if he knew about it. Maybe it was time to stop protecting their feelings about my life choices. I almost didn't go, but something told me this wedding would be different. 3 weeks before the reception, I got an unexpected call from James, Tessa's fiancé. We'd only met a handful of times at family events, but he'd always been polite and seemed genuinely decent. What he told me that day changed everything about how I viewed this wedding. "Julian," he said carefully, "I need to show you something. I've been hearing your parents say things about you to wedding guests, and I don't think you know how extensive it's gotten." He met me for coffee the next day and pulled out his phone. Screenshots of text conversations, saved voicemails, even email chains, where Mom and Dad had been actively telling extended family and wedding guests that I was struggling with direction, still trying to figure out his life, and had never really found stable work after college. The lies were systematic and cruel. They'd told people I'd dropped out of business school when I actually graduated summa cum laude. They claimed I was bouncing between jobs when I'd been building the same company for 8 years. Most devastating was seeing them tell guests not to ask me about work because it was a sensitive subject, and I was embarrassed about my situation. James handed me screenshots that would change everything at tonight's reception. The wedding ceremony was beautiful. I'll give Tessa that. St. Mark's Cathedral, 200 guests string quartet playing Pachelbel as she walked down the aisle in her designer dress. Everything Robert's money could buy to showcase his successful daughter's perfect day. I sat in the back row exactly where families put the relatives they have to invite, but don't particularly want front and center. Cousins I barely knew filled the seats between me and the rest of the family. The seating arrangement told the whole story. I was there out of obligation, not celebration. During the cocktail hour before the reception, I watched Robert work the room like the executive he'd always been. Firm handshakes, business card exchanges, conversations about portfolios and market trends. This was his element, and every interaction reinforced the narrative he'd carefully crafted about his family's success. But I was also doing my own calculating. The bartenders were pouring generous glasses of Kaix Blanco for every guest who wanted premium tequila. I watched Robert's golf buddies, Tessa's law firm colleagues, Mom's book club, friends, all of them sampling my product without having any idea who'd created it. During the ceremony, I counted how many guests were drinking Kaix without knowing. That's when Robert's dismissive commentary reached its peak. I was standing near the bar when he approached with Uncle Frank, his voice carrying just loud enough for surrounding guests to overhear. "You know, Frank, I keep hoping Julian will figure things out eventually," Dad said, gesturing toward me with that familiar tone of disappointment. But at 32 still bartending at family events. Well, some people just never find their direction. Uncle Frank nodded sympathetically, taking another sip of what I knew was my award-winning tequila. It's tough when kids don't live up to their potential. At least you've got Tessa. Exactly. Tessa's the one who really made us proud. Partnership track at her firm, this beautiful wedding, marrying a man with real prospects. Sometimes I think Julian missed the gene for ambition. I watched Dad tell Uncle Frank how disappointed he was in his bartender son, while Frank sipped my award-winning tequila. But here's what made the whole situation absolutely surreal. The guests couldn't stop talking about the drinks. Throughout the cocktail hour, I overheard at least a dozen conversations praising the exceptional tequila selection and wondering where Tessa and James had found such high-quality spirits. "This tequila is incredible," said one of Tessa's colleagues from the law firm. "It's smooth enough to drink neat, but complex enough for cocktails. I've never had anything like it." Another guest, someone from James's finance company, actually approached me at the bar. "Whoever chose this Kaix Blanco knows their spirits. This is restaurant-quality stuff. Have you ever tried it before?" I smiled and told him I was familiar with the brand. Very familiar. 3 different guests complimented the exceptional tequila choice to my face. By the time cocktail hour transitioned into dinner, the family's condescension had reached new heights. Tessa was in full bride mode, accepting congratulations and making sure everyone knew about her partnership track at the law firm. But even on her special day, she couldn't resist taking shots at my life choices. "Oh, Julian's still figuring things out," she told a group of her sorority sisters when they asked what I did for work. "You know how it is with creative types, always trying different projects." Her maid of honor, Ashley, turned to me with that fake, sympathetic smile people use when they think they're being kind, but are actually being patronizing. "That's so brave of you to keep exploring. Are you still doing the bartending thing, or have you moved on to something new?" I smiled and told her I was still very involved in the spirits industry. Tessa's maid of honor asked if I still did the bartending thing, but it was Mom who really crossed the line during the pre-dinner reception. I was standing near the family photo area when I overheard her talking to a group of Dad's colleagues from his investment firm. She was in full damage control mode, managing the family image like she always did. "Well, we're so proud of Tessa's success," Mom said, gesturing toward my sister. "She's always been our focused one. Julian." Bless his heart, took a different path. He never quite finished college and has struggled to find direction. We keep hoping he'll settle into something stable, but you know how some young people are these days. The lies were breathtaking in their audacity. Not only had I graduated summa cum laude, but I'd been building the same company for 8 years. The struggling to find direction narrative was particularly cruel, considering I'd just been featured in Forbes magazine. I overheard Mom telling guests I never finished college and struggled with direction. That's when something inside me shifted. I'd spent years protecting my family's feelings by staying quiet about my success. I'd let them maintain their narrative about my failure because confronting it seemed like more trouble than it was worth. But standing there listening to my mother lie to a room full of people while they sipped my award-winning tequila, I realized I was done being their scapegoat. The wedding program listed several planned toasts: Dad's welcome speech, James's thank you to the families, Tessa's parents' blessing for the couple. But there was no mention of the bride's brother speaking. That was about to change. That's when I decided it was time for the wedding speech I never planned to give. I caught James's eye across the room and nodded slightly. He understood immediately. The conversation we'd had 3 weeks ago, the screenshots he'd shown me, the systematic lies my family had been spreading. He nodded back, his expression a mix of support and anticipation. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the Forbes article that had been published 2 months earlier. The headline read, 30 under 30, Julian Martinez's Kaix Spirits disrupts premium tequila market. Below that was a photo of me in my distillery, surrounded by oak barrels and copper stills. I had my phone ready with the Forbes article and a room full of witnesses. The moment came during the transition between dinner courses when guests were relaxed and wine had loosened everyone's tongues. The DJ was taking requests, the dance floor was getting ready to open, and the energy in the room was perfect for what I was about to do. I walked over to the small stage where the microphone was set up for the planned speeches. The wedding coordinator looked confused as I approached. I wasn't on her list, but I smiled and gestured toward James, who nodded his approval from the head table. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, tapping the microphone gently. "I know I'm not on the official toast list tonight, but I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment. I wanted to thank you all for being here to celebrate Tessa and James, and especially for enjoying the exceptional spirit selection tonight." I paused and raised my glass of Kaix Blanco, making sure everyone could see the distinctive bottle design. I have to say, whoever chose Kaix spirits for tonight's bar service has incredible taste. This tequila has been recognized by industry experts featured in Forbes magazine and represents some of the finest craftsmanship in premium spirits. The room was listening politely, probably wondering where this random endorsement was going. I could see Robert's face starting to show confusion and mild irritation. I took the microphone and thanked everyone for celebrating with Kaix spirits. "You know," I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "it's particularly meaningful to me because Kaix Spirits isn't just any tequila company. It's my tequila company. I'm Julian Martinez, and I'm the founder and CEO of Kaix Spirits." The silence that followed was deafening. 200 wedding guests suddenly stopped their conversations, put down their forks, and stared at me with expressions ranging from surprise to confusion to fascination. I could see Mom's wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, Dad's face going through several shades of red, and Tessa looking like she'd been struck by lightning. The room went silent when I mentioned that Kaix was my company. That's when James stood up from the head table, his groom's tuxedo catching the light as he walked toward the microphone. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd been waiting for this moment, "I can confirm that. Julian, would you mind if I shared something with our guests?" He took the microphone with my permission and faced the room. "When Tessa and I were planning this wedding, I specifically requested Kaix Spirits for our bar service. Not because I knew Julian personally, we'd only met a few times, but because I'd read about his company in Forbes magazine. I was impressed by the story of a young entrepreneur who'd built a multi-million-dollar premium spirits company from the ground up. James's words were carrying weight because he had credibility. He was the groom, a successful finance director, someone whose judgment about business success meant something to this than the crowd of corporate professionals. "I have to admit," James continued, "I was surprised when I learned that Tessa's family had never mentioned Julian's achievements. In fact, I was told he was, well, let's just say the family narrative about Julian didn't match what I'd read in Forbes." James confirmed he'd specifically chosen Kaix because he knew it was Julian's company. The impact was immediate and spreading like wildfire through the reception hall. I could see guests turning to each other with whispered questions, pulling out their phones, and looking between me and my family with new understanding. The corporate executives who'd dismissed me as the bartender an hour earlier were now staring with expressions of recalibration. Uncle Frank was holding his glass of Kaix Blanco and looking at it like he was seeing it for the first time. Several of Dad's golf buddies were huddled together, clearly trying to process what they'd just learned. Tessa's law firm colleagues were exchanging glances that suggested they were re-evaluating everything they'd been told about the family dynamics. But the most telling reaction was happening at tables throughout the room. Guests were discreetly pulling out their smartphones and typing. I could see phone screens glowing with Google searches, and I knew exactly what they were looking for verification of what I'd just claimed. I watched guests start Googling Kaix Spirits founder on their phones. Robert's reaction was immediate and predictable. The moment he saw phones coming out across the reception hall, he went into full corporate damage control mode. He stood up from the family table, straightened his tie, and launched into the kind of spin that had served him well in boardrooms for decades. "Well, that's wonderful news about Julian's little venture," he said loudly, projecting his voice to reach nearby tables without needing the microphone. "You know how it is these days. Anyone can start a small business. Technology has really democratized entrepreneurship. Good for Julian for giving it a try." His tone was dismissive, condescending, designed to minimize what I'd just revealed. He was treating my $12 million company like a lemonade stand, hoping to salvage the narrative he'd spent years building. But the damage was already done. Dad tried telling guests that anyone can start a small business these days. While Robert was spinning, the guests were fact-checking. And what they found was destroying his credibility in real time. I could see phone screens lighting up with search results, Forbes articles, and industry profiles. The corporate executives who'd nodded sympathetically when Robert called me a disappointment were now reading about my company's market disruption and rapid growth. Uncle Frank was the first to hit pay dirt. He'd been one of Dad's most loyal supporters, always ready with a sympathetic comment about Robert's challenging younger son. But now he was staring at his iPhone with an expression of complete shock. "Robert," he called out, his voice carrying across several tables. "I'm looking at a Forbes article from 2 months ago. It says Julian's company is valued at $12 million. And is one of the fastest-growing premium spirits companies in America." The reception hall got very quiet very quickly. Uncle Frank Googled Julian Kaix Forbes, and his face told the whole story. That's when the questions started coming from multiple directions. Tessa's law firm colleagues, Dad's golf buddies, Mom's book club friends. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know why the family had never mentioned Julian's obvious success. The narrative Robert and Mom had been spreading for years was crumbling under public scrutiny. "Wait," said one of Tessa's colleagues, looking between me and my parents with confusion. "Didn't you tell us Julian was still figuring out his career path? This Forbes article makes it sound like he's a major industry player." Another guest chimed in. "And didn't someone mention he never finished college? This profile says he graduated summa cum laude from business school." The contradictions were piling up, and every question made my family's lies more obvious. Years of carefully crafted deception were unraveling in front of 200 witnesses. Guests started asking why the family had never mentioned Julian's Forbes feature. I stood there, watching the truth spread like wildfire through the reception hall. People were sharing their phone screens, reading quotes from the Forbes article out loud, and looking at my parents with expressions that had shifted from sympathy to skepticism to outright confusion. Finally, someone from James's finance company called out, "Julian, do you have a copy of that Forbes article? We'd love to see the full story." Someone asked to see the Forbes article, and I was happy to oblige. I pulled out my phone and opened the Forbes article that had been published just 2 months earlier. The headline read, 30 under 30, Julian Martinez's Kaix Spirits disrupts premium tequila market with $12 million valuation. Below it was a professional photo of me in our distillery, surrounded by copper stills and oak barrels, looking exactly like what I was, a successful CEO building an empire. "Here it is," I said, holding up my phone so the surrounding tables could see the screen. Forbes featured Kaix Spirits as one of the fastest-growing companies in the premium spirits industry. They called me one of the top young entrepreneurs in America. I passed my phone to Uncle Frank, who had been so eager to see the article. His eyes widened as he read the opening paragraph out loud. "Julian Martinez, 32, has built Kaix Spirits from a bootstrap startup into a $12 million premium tequila company that's reshaping the craft spirits market." The Forbes article showed Kaix valued at $12 million, with Julian as founder. Robert's reaction was immediate and spectacular. His carefully maintained corporate composure completely shattered as he watched his 15-year narrative crumble in real time. His face went from red to purple, and I could see the veins in his neck bulging as he processed what was happening. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his voice getting louder and more frantic. "Forbes writes about hundreds of companies. It doesn't mean anything special. Anyone can get press coverage if they hire the right PR firm." But even as he said it, guests were passing around my phone, reading the article details, and comparing what they were seeing to what they'd been told about me for years. Robert's attempts at damage control were only making him look more desperate and dishonest. $12 million, Robert," Uncle Frank said quietly. "The article says Julian's company is valued at $12 million. That's not PR fluff. That's real business success." Dad's face turned red as he realized his lies were exposed to everyone. The social transformation in that room was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Suddenly, every guest who had nodded politely when I was introduced as the bartender was approaching me with congratulations, bonus cards, and genuine respect. The same corporate executives who had dismissed me an hour earlier were now asking about distribution partnerships and investment opportunities. "Julian!" "I had no idea," said one of Dad's golf partners, shaking my hand enthusiastically. "I run procurement for a major restaurant chain. We should definitely talk about featuring Kaix in our premium spirits program." Tessa's law firm colleagues were practically lining up to apologize for their earlier assumptions. "We work with a lot of startups," one of them said. "Getting Forbes recognition at your age is incredibly rare. You must be doing something extraordinary." The irony was perfect. The same people who had been told I was a struggling disappointment were now treating me like exactly what I was, a successful entrepreneur who had built something remarkable. Every guest who dismissed the bartender was suddenly congratulating the CEO, but the most devastating part was watching my family's credibility evaporate in real time. Guests weren't just congratulating me. They were questioning how Robert and Mom could have been so completely wrong about their own son's life. "I don't understand," said one of Mom's book club friends, looking confused and slightly disturbed. "How do you not know that your son owns a $12 million company? How do you not know he was featured in Forbes magazine?" Another guest was more direct. "Robert, you told us Julian was struggling to find direction, but this article is from 2 months ago. Were you not aware of his success?" The questions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last. Guests started asking how the family could not know about Julian's success. That's when something beautiful happened. Grandpa Harold, Dad's 80-year-old father, who rarely spoke at family events, slowly stood up from his table. He raised his glass of Kaix Blanco and addressed the entire reception hall. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "to Julian, who built an empire while we weren't paying attention. Sometimes the family disappointment turns out to be the family success story." He paused, making sure everyone was listening. "Julian started this company after bartending school, and he never stopped building it, even when some of us," he looked directly at Robert, "forgot to believe in him. Tonight, we're all drinking the proof of his success." The entire room raised their glasses, and I felt something I'd never experienced in 32 years of family gatherings, complete undeniable validation. Grandpa Harold raised his glass and toasted, "Julian's empire built from bartending school." After Grandpa Harold's toast, the reception hall erupted in applause, and Robert found himself in an impossible position. 200 wedding guests had just witnessed undeniable proof of his son's extraordinary success, and his decades of dismissive narrative lay in ruins around him. He stood up slowly, his face still flushed from embarrassment and rage, but the fight had gone out of him. The corporate executive who had always controlled every family story was now facing a room full of people who knew he'd been systematically lying about his own son. "Well," he said, finally. His voice strained, but attempting to maintain some dignity. I suppose congratulations are in order. Julian has clearly built something significant with his company. The words came out like he was swallowing glass, but he had no choice. The Forbes article was right there on phones throughout the room. The $12 million valuation was real. The industry recognition was documented. Dad had no choice but to publicly acknowledge his son's multi-million-dollar empire. The shift in family dynamics was immediate and permanent. Tessa, who had spent 32 years basking in golden child privilege, approached me during the dancing portion of the reception. Her expression was a mixture of embarrassment, respect, and something I'd never seen from her before. Genuine remorse. "Julian," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology, we all do. I had no idea about the extent of your success, and I realize now that we've been incredibly unfair to you for years." She paused, looking around at the wedding guests who were still talking about the Forbes article revelation. "I'm sorry for dismissing what you built. I'm sorry for calling it your bartending phase like it wasn't real work. You proved tonight that you were building something incredible while we were too blind to see it." Tessa apologized for years of dismissing my bartending. 6 months later, our family gatherings look completely different. Robert and Mom still struggle with the reality that their disappointment son became more financially successful than their golden child, but they can't argue with documented facts. The condescending comments stopped entirely after the wedding video went viral on social media. Kaix Spirits has continued growing. We've expanded into whiskey, and we're looking at international distribution. But more importantly, I finally have something I'd never experienced in 32 years of family life respect, based on who I actually am, not who they thought I should be. Part. Every family celebration now serves Kaix exclusively. They request it specifically, and I love watching Robert raise toasts with the product he once dismissed as part of my bartending thing. Turns out the bartender built an empire while they weren't watching.